Well, welcome back. Now, last weekend, the honorary president of Reform UK, Nigel Farage, was accused of Islamophobia after claiming during a Sky News interview that a growing number of young people in this country do not subscribe to British values, later clarifying that he was referring to Muslims. Now, to back this up, he cited recent surveys that say 46% of British Muslims support Hamas, support a terror organisation prescribed in this country. Now, the Foreign Office Minister, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, also claimed in an interview this week that some Muslims in Britain want to challenge fundamental UK values. But what's the truth here? Do British Muslims not share the same values as other integrated communities? Well, joining me now to discuss this is author and researcher Dr. Rakib Ehsan and deputy editor of Spiked, Fraser Myers. Fraser, I'll start with you. How are you? Thank you for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, this is a very difficult one, isn't it? Nigel Farage made these comments on another broadcaster, essentially suggesting that some British people don't belong here. That's essentially what he was saying. They don't subscribe to our values and the like. Is there truth to that, or do you think that he was exaggerating?
I think he was exaggerating. I think there are very good reasons to question that polling, suggesting that a near, almost half of Muslims support Hamas. I don't believe that at all. I think, there are problems with the questioning and the wording of that polling that made people pick that option. For instance, we can go into that in a bit of detail later, perhaps. And again, I don't think it would be right to say that anything like a majority of British Muslims are against British values or are, somehow hostile to the nation they live in. But what there is a deeper underlying problem of Islamism within very small pockets of the Muslim community. And I worry that the reaction to Farage's comments, immediately dismissing them as Islamophobic, could derail that conversation that we need to have. And the general election is a good time to have that conversation, I think. Some of the issues, for instance, that we need to be talking about are Islamist terrorism. Islamist terrorism remains the predominant terror threat. I mean, from 7/7 onwards, I think it's 94 people have been killed by Islamist extremist terrorists compared to just 3 by the far right. We have serious problems of anti-Semitism within the Muslim community. Again, nothing anywhere close to a majority by any means of the imagination, but slightly worse than the population as a whole. We also have a problem of sort of a creeping blasphemy laws coming into Britain where, people have been sent into hiding for insulting Muhammad or showing cartoons of Muhammad or defacing the Quran. Those are serious problems that we need our politicians to get on top of, and they can't be derailed. They shouldn't be derailed by either accusations of Islamophobia, and nor should people be exaggerating the scale of them as well, because that's not helpful either.
But Fraser, how do our politicians talk about this without being accused of Islamophobia? Because they are essentially targeting British Muslims with their comments, and a lot of people aren't willing to even accept the difference between Islamist and Muslim sometimes. I'm seeing quite a lot of that. People saying, you don't mean Islamist, you just mean all Muslims. How do politicians get around this?
Yeah, that is a real problem. And I think there are almost sort of parallel problems on the right and the left where, so someone like Nigel Farage will say, Hamas represents British Muslims, or not quite that, but you know what I mean, stretched in that direction. And then you'll have people on the left, or often actually sometimes just people in the authorities, who will say, oh, you can't talk about Islamist extremism because that will offend Muslims. Well, I'm sorry, Muslims are not offended by discussions of Islamist extremism. Muslims are worried about Islamist extremism. In fact, there's evidence to say that they're more willing to talk to the authorities if they suspect someone as being an extremist. So we have to knock this idea on the head that it's an impossible discussion to have. We just need politicians to be braver, I think, essentially, in confronting these things.
I mean, Dr. Rakib Ehsan, good to speak to you as well on this. Yesterday, we saw a huge protest in central London, led by Tommy Robinson. Lots of people out with union flags. They were protesting two-tier policing, but there were some chants that have been captured in footage that could be deemed Islamophobic. Rakib, where are we with all of this? Because we see so many different protests, all different politics, and most of us just want a cohesive society.
Oh, no, absolutely, Emily. That is ultimately what the vast majority of the British population want. They want a stable, cohesive society. For them, to live in, along with their children, and if they're old enough, their grandchildren as well. I'd make the point, I don't want to give yesterday's protests too much significance. There's a variety of sources suggesting that it wasn't particularly large in number, especially when you compare it to the number of the pro-Palestine demonstrations which have taken place with regularity over the past few months. But going back to the discussion about British Muslims, I think we need to get away from that phrase British Muslim community. We're talking about an incredibly diverse population. And I think you make such a good point about drawing out that differentiation between Islamists and British Muslims. Now, if you actually look at existing survey data, the level of concern over Islamist extremism, which is the principal terror threat in the UK, the level of concern among British Muslims is actually very similar to the wider public. I'd actually make the argument that moderate British Muslims who simply want to get on with their lives, they actually face various forms of Islamist intimidation, attempted coercion on a far more regular basis than the vast majority of the non-Muslim population in the UK. So I think we just need a bit more nuance in this debate. I think Nigel Farage's comments, which I took issue with and actually wrote about in The Spectator. Of course, there's concerns in terms of the level of segregation within certain British Muslim communities. Fraser there's talked about higher than normal levels of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic conspiratorial beliefs. I think that more recently we've even seen this worrying rise in Islamo-Nazism, where you're seeing radicalized young British Muslims indulging in the glorification of Nazi Germany, glorifying Adolf Hitler. So there are very problematic trends. But what you need to do, we need to work more with decent-hearted British Muslims who take pride in their British identity. There's far more than some people may think, and really work with them in terms of trying to create that cohesive society that we want to live in. Because if they're increasingly sidelined, and if our politicians actually platform the more vocal and divisive elements of the population, then we won't make much headway at all.
Yes, there's an issue with platforming the extremes of any community. Rakib, though, with Nigel did make the point that younger British Muslims may have more extreme views. Is that something that you see as well? Because people do assume that, you know, when people come to this country, that future generations will, you know, have more British values, so to speak. But could it be going the other way? Unfortunately, that younger Muslims are more, you know, listening to more of these sort of conspiracies about the Jews or whatever else it is.
I think what's interesting is that we're not as traditional as we used to be as a society. As you know, Emily, there's growing forms of family breakdown. I think there's been a loss of community spirit, which has come with industrial decline in many parts of the country. There's rampant loneliness among the elderly. So I think with that, our mainstream society has become less traditional. In my view, there's been growing levels of secularism and indeed individualism. So I think what you might see a backlash to that, or a cultural resistance to that among British-born Muslims who will still retain a strong attachment to their faith and may have more traditional views. I mean, I'll just give another example. It's almost become mainstream political debate in terms of actually discussing whether a biological male could even be considered a woman. Now, even among the more liberal sections of the British Muslim population, think, hang on, this is all a bit weird. This is a bit bizarre. So I think that we really need to understand these cultural trends when we're trying to look to establish a more cohesive society. And there are various challenges on that front.
Sadly, we're going to have to leave it there. We could have talked about this all afternoon, but I'll let you both go.